Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly trippy world of Roman recreational chemistry. The civilization that gave us aqueducts, roads, and apparently parties that could rival your college roommate's worst decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with the Romans' most famous botanical party trick: wine kissed with sleep flowers, poppy and mandrake. You've probably seen poppies on statues and frescoes, elegant seed heads, nestled beside Bacchus, or woven into garlands at banquets, like an ancient version of cheers. But these plants weren't just ornamental. Romans believed they had sacred properties and mild psychoactive ones. Yes, poppy-laced wine or a whisper of mandrake could get you a little bit floaty. The method was simple. Slice the dried root or bruise the pods and steep them in wine, sometimes days. Then drink the infusion at festivals, ceremonies, or presumably whenever you felt like tuning out the sound of 200 citizens, chanting hymns at top volume. The result was a soft, dreamy euphoria. Not enough to make you forget your name, but enough to make paving a road to Horizon sound like a fun group project. Now, to be clear, the Romans didn't call it getting high. They called it communing with the gods. Poppies were linked with sleep, dreams, and the god Somnus, which made them perfect for temple rituals and funerary rites. Lifting a cup was a symbolic way of sipping divinity. And okay, maybe a great way to take the edge off after a long day of ruling a province or surviving the Forum. It was everywhere in art. Bacchus is shown holding it. Party guests at banquets passed garlands and cups like a floral peace pipe, and even tombs got offerings to sweeten the afterlife. The thinking seemed to be, if we're traveling to eternity, let's make sure we're stocked up. Practical. But the poppy and its friends weren't just ceremonial. Festivals could get wild, and infused wine made the music louder, the dancing looser, and the Latin poetry more profound. Imagine a crowd under the stars sipping spiced wine, feeling as light as a laurel leaf in the breeze. For the Romans, that was spiritual fulfillment, and really a very good night. There are religious holidays. And then there's Saturnalia, the Roman equivalent of saying, let's black out in honor of the Golden Age. Subtle name? No. Accurate? Extremely. This annual celebration revolved around Saturn and the promise of freedom, when rules were flipped and laughter did the governing. Romans told stories of God time, when labor paused and everyone ate, drank, and forgot their grudges. To honor that amnesia, they filled the city with lights, dice, gifts, and cups that never seemed to empty. They crowned a lord of misrule, traded togas for caps, and yelled Eve Saturnalia, until the neighbors gave up. To commemorate this heroic hangover, citizens gathered once a year to get thoroughly obliterated. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. The goal was to drink until one entered a divine trance, which sounds poetic until you remember this often meant collapsing face first onto an atrium floor while strangers sang obscene verses between hiccups. The revels began at dawn with music, clapping, and the ceremonial passing of drinks. Hosts encouraged revelers to drink as much as your heart desires, which in this context was less of a blessing and more of a dare. Participants clanged cymbals, danced in the streets, and reportedly saw the god, although whether that was Saturn or just the side of a terracotta jug is unclear. But this wasn't just chaos for chaos's sake. Well, mostly not. The idea was to honor the balance between restraint and joy, reminding everyone that even stern deities could be pacified with a strong enough brew. Think of it as theology meets keg stand. And importantly, this was sanctioned behavior. There were no awkward conversations the next day about what happened in the sacred grove. Getting drunk was part of the job description. If anything, not passing out was suspicious. Why aren't you spiritually elevated, Gaius? Do you hate the gods? Modern scholars have described Saturnalia and the Bacchanalia as rituals of renewal for many. Participants purged their fears, inhibitions, and likely their stomach contents, all in one divinely authorized party. The next day, headaches, regret, possibly a new scar shaped like a laurel, but also spiritual cleansing. Forget everything you know about wine. Roman wine wasn't crystal clear, gently carbonated, or anything resembling a chilled rose you'd order at a bar. It was syrupy, resinous, flavored, and alarmingly opaque, served with the kind of consistency that would confuse your sommelier and your dentist. Wine for the Romans was not just a social drink. It was practically a food group, reduced to syrup as defrutum or cepa, stretched with water into posca, perfumed into conditum, honeyed into mulsum, and poured by amphora. It resembled a medicinal broth more than a refreshing spritz. The technical term might be liquid vineyard, but let's not pretend this wasn't a bowl of grapes in denial. This wine was consumed by everyone. Senators, soldiers, children, scribes, and anyone else trying to survive in a world where summer heat, taxes, and projects were concerns. It was calorically dense, slightly intoxicating, and cheaper than anything else that didn't require chasing it down with a spear. And here's the twist. Wine wasn't just for sustenance. It was intentionally altered with herbs, spices, and other curious additives, especially during festivals or religious ceremonies. Want to commune with the gods? Add a shaving of mandrake? Want to forget the augur's speech? Toss in a little raisin must and hope for the best. Of course, hygiene was a concern, but wine had an answer for that too. Water could kill you, but wine had been boiled, fermented, and spiced. It was safer than the Tiber, and often more reliable than your coworkers. In terms of strength, Roman wine ranged from mildly numbing to I forgot how sandals work. While the alcohol content wasn't high by standards once diluted, the sheer quantity consumed made up for it. Workers on state projects like road building or aqueducts were often issued drink rations, a daily stipend of posca or wine, which means that half of Roman labor policy was fueled by liquid grapes and mild intoxication. Let's talk wine. Or rather, let's talk about a viscous grape-adjacent fluid that the Romans called wine and that sommeliers would call a war crime. Roman wine was less refreshing beverage and more fermented soup with ambition, made by crushing grapes, oiling the must into sticky syrups, blending with seawater or pitch, and diluting the whole affair at the table and letting it sit in open mixing bowls. The final product could be cloudy, chunky, and distressingly chewable. Imagine broth if broth had opinions and a mild buzz. But despite its texture, which archaeologists generously describe as rustic, this was the drink of the people. Everyone drank it, senators, priests, peasants, toddlers, because when water might kill you, and milk was suspicious, wine was the least deadly option with a side effect. It was calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating, and often served in communal craters, because nothing says spiritual unity like 5 adults slurping from a bowl of soggy grape water. At temples and festivals, the wine might be enhanced with myrtle, pepper, saffron, dates, honey, or mystery ingredients that were either sacred or experimental. Historians are still unsure if the addition of mandrake was intentional, or if someone was just tired of reality. This was also the go-to morale booster for laborers and legionaries. Builders didn't clock out with craft beer. They received daily drink rations, sometimes several sexteri per day. This means the guys hauling paving stones all morning were doing it buzzed and sticky. And somehow the aqueducts still got built. Let that sink in the next time you miss a deadline with a cappuccino in hand. Taste probably awful. But if you're living in 1300 years before espresso, covered in dust, and trying not to die of dysentery, A lukewarm cup of Posca is Michelin star cuisine. Also, no foam, no carbonation, no glass bottles, just ceramic amphorae, ladles and strainers to catch the bigger floaters, and a commitment to ignoring mouthfeel. Now that you've washed down your honeyed wine with a poppy soft buzz, it's time to set the mood with smoke. But not just any smoke. We're talking suffamenta, the Roman incense blends that made temples smell like divine bakeries and left everyone wondering whether they were actually meditating or just very, very lightheaded. Incense wasn't a quick hit of frankincense. This was the perfumed love child of an apothecary and a pastry chef. Recipes varied by cult and city, but the ingredients often included myrrh, honey, wine, raisins, cinnamon, nard, storax, juniper, mint, and whatever other spices were lying around not being sacrificed. Mix it all up, let it rest, press it into pastilles, and burn them slowly in sacred spaces until everyone either felt deeply spiritual or forgot why they walked in. It was used in lustrations, which is code for, let's fill this room with enough fragrant smoke to erase our sins, or at least our memories of last night's Saturnalia. Temples didn't have ventilation, by the way. That was considered breaking the mood. So imagine standing in a marble sala, next to a sweating flamen waving a smoking dish from his acera, like it's Febreze for the soul, while a chant drones in Latin monotone behind you. Visions weren't just encouraged. They were practically inevitable. Whether divine revelation or mild asphyxiation, it didn't really matter. The gods got their tribute either way. To Romans, incense wasn't just air freshener. It was medicine, perfume, and spiritual elevator all in one. Pliny the Elder later wrote that certain blends could chill pain and improve sleep, which makes sense if you assume the goal was to pass out entirely. Some recipes were so complex they read like ancient IKEA manuals. 16 ingredients, each added in precise phases under specific moons. Honestly, it's a miracle anything got done. But once lit, the aroma drifted across the forum like a sacred fog machine, signaling that something holy was happening, or that someone was overcompensating for yesterday's fish market. Even in death, the smoke lingered. It was burned at funerals, sealed in tombs, and probably responsible for at least one senator being accidentally embalmed in a spice rub. In short, incense was Rome's way of saying, if you can't drink it, burn it and breathe deeply. If poppy wine was Rome's chill friend, and Saffamenta were the drama queen with a smoke machine, then mandrake was the slightly unhinged guest you invited once and immediately regretted. With its forked roots that vaguely resembled tiny humans and a reputation that scared even seasoned priests, mandrake was less herbal remedy and more botanical dare, used in Roman medicine as both a painkiller and a possible aphrodisiac, which is always a terrifying combination. Mandrake earned its place in temple recipes and medical notes with the kind of cautious reverence usually reserved for wild animals and magistrates in a mad mood. The herbal manuals think Dioscorides with a subscription to chaos list mandrake for insomnia, fertility, and strengthening the heart, which sounds noble until you remember that the wrong dose could just as easily strengthen your heart into cardiac arrest. C. Mandrake contains alkaloids like scopolamine and atropine, a kind of compounds that mess with your nervous system and occasionally convince you that your bed is melting. In small doses, it was mildly relaxing. In slightly bigger ones, welcome to night terrors, starring Saturn and a crocodile in a wig borrowed from the arena. And then there's the harvesting myth. According to later folklore, repeated by writers who loved good shiver, pulling a mandrake root out of the ground caused it to scream loudly, lethally. So naturally, the solution was to tie it to a dog, cover your ears, and let the poor creature yank it free while you hoped your neighbors didn't ask too many questions. While there's no solid evidence Romans were tying plants to dogs and waiting for shrieks, the idea that the plant had spiritual and slightly terrifying power fits right in. Mandrake may have been used in rituals fertility rites, or just slipped into wine for those who preferred their hallucinations with a rooty aftertaste. In any case, it wasn't the everyday herb. Mandrake was for priests, magicians, and those who didn't mind taking medical advice from a man wearing a laurel and suspicious confidence at midnight. Used with respect, mandrake could lull you to sleep, numb an ache, and maybe coax a sultry couplet out of a tired poet. Used without a plan, you'd wake 4 days later insisting you were a sacred beetle of Jupiter and demanding someone roll you up a hill. Somewhere in the scroll-stuffed cupboards of Roman medical lore, wedged between cures for dog bites and the proper placement of amulets on irritated body parts, sits a low, calm mention of cannabis. That's right, hemp with ambitions. Because when pain needed quieting, Romans didn't only count on divine favor or chewing reeds until problems blurred. Sometimes they reached for something a little more herbal. Cannabis turns up in writers like Pliny, Dioscorides, and later Galen, mostly as a treatment for inflammation, sore joints, earaches, and certain obstinate complaints below the waist. Yes, gynecological. Roman women may have had access to THC, adjacent pessaries, and soothing salves, which sounds like a wellness trend an artisan in Trastevere is itching to relaunch on a market stall. Of course, no evidence of rolled joints or brownie pans, at least none anyone left lying around. More often it was crushed into oil, stirred into unguents, or blended with honey, because if you're going to medicate, you might as well make it taste-friendly. Applied to skin, it eased pain. Inhaled by accident? Now the temple smoke starts to make an awkward kind of sense. Was it recreational? Officially, no. Unofficially, probably. When you're running a civilization in oven-hot summers with limited plumbing and an extremely capricious tax collector, nobody blames you for misjudging the dosage. And if a flayman begins addressing bronze statues with a little too much confidence, who's to say that isn't a message from the Capitoline? There's physical evidence, too. Residues from braziers, amphorae, and dental calculus have turned up traces of curious plant compounds, cannabis among them, alongside poppy and the occasional nicotine surprise, either pharmacology in action, or the world's most suspicious grave offerings. And don't forget the clergy. These were people trained to chant for hours, read dreams, and stare into incense until something stared back. If their rites involved cannabis, it wasn't for giggles. It was to grease the hinges between mortal and divine, or at the very least, between citizen and wall. Somewhere in the dim, sweet-smelling corners of a Roman temple storeroom or a surgeon's chest in a valetudinarium, behind dried lizards and respectable ointments, sat the opium stash. Small, wrinkled poppy heads from the eastern Mediterranean tucked away like a state secret. Because when plague, pain, and road-building backs flared, prayer alone didn't always cut it. Not native to Italy, the poppy gum likely arrived through trade with Cyprus or Cilicia. The Romans were enthusiastic adopters. By the early empire, poppies were well on their way to becoming the ancient world's go-to sedative, a medical miracle wrapped in gentle dependency. Opium didn't merely dull pain. It smoothed childbirth, calmed coughs, soothed riotous guts, and made hymns to cosmic order feel suspiciously on beat. Taken in wine, folded into pills, or, because of course introduced as suppositories, it became the pharmaceutical way of saying, don't worry about it. Naturally, it found a home in the sacred medicine cupboard, a shelf where healing met holy theater. Priests moonlighting as medics dispensed it during rites and serious treatments, probably murmuring, "This will ease the divine tension in your spleen." Whether your god was furious or your nerves were, opium could pacify both. The texts don't always name it plainly too helpful, but they refer to juices of the poppy in the same coy tone modern labels used for natural flavors, which is never reassuring. But let's not pretend it was all medicinal. There's always a smudged boundary between spiritual elevation and an excellent nap. And for the elite, especially at funerals and last rites, Opium may have joined the send-off. What better way to face Orcus than blissed out and blissfully unaware of the household dog licking your face? Like many of Rome's sacred substances, opium was part remedy, part comfort, part managed chaos. Used wisely, it quieted agony. Used foolishly, it rewrote mornings and afternoons into mythic confetti. Used poorly, it turned temple assistants into spaced-out background dancers. Still, in a world of tooth drills, tax farmers, and sirocco winds, a little somnolent magic went a long way. Wine in ancient Rome was a badge of sophistication, a drink of the gods, a toast to Bacchus. But don't let the elegant amphorae fool you. This stuff could hit like a chariot crash, especially when it came laced with the ancient equivalent of a little something extra. Wines weren't just fermented grape juice. They were infusions, concoctions, and occasional experiments in altered consciousness. Romans flavored their wine with everything from mandrake and poppy to myrtle, pepper, and resin. Ingredients that sound ceremonial until you realize they were probably added for maximum mood enhancement. Religious festivals were the main stage for these potent potables. At Saturnalia, for example, participants didn't sip wine to appreciate terroir. They chugged it to achieve metaphysical disconnection. The idea wasn't to be tipsy. It was to teeter between dimensions, possibly while dancing with a priest in a spotted pelt. These spiked brews were often described in medical notes as remedies, which is how you know things were getting creative. Got a headache? Try wine infused with sleepy syrups. Sore joints? How about some resin-kissed red aged 2 weeks in a clay jar? Existential dread. Well, that one needed priestly supervision and possibly a floor mat. And it wasn't just mortals enjoying this liquid therapy. The gods themselves were believed to appreciate a good spiked offering. Vats of wine were ritually poured out in temples, left as grave gifts, and used in ceremonies to help the divine descend into statues, or at least wobble in their general direction. Let's be clear, this wasn't your average table wine. Depending on the additives, these sacred brews could calm nerves, ease pain, or launch a midsummer banquet into full mystery cult territory. And because everything was part of a ritual, no one could really question the dosage. If the room spun, it was spiritual. If you passed out in the laurel grove, that was divine communion. For the Romans, wine wasn't just a beverage. It was a vehicle, one that could take you to enlightenment, to sleep, or into the arms of a very confused river god. For a civilization obsessed with order, ritual, and straight roads, the Romans had a surprisingly open mind about trance states. In fact, they encouraged them, just not during accounting. These altered mental states were seen as direct channels to the divine, or at least to some deeply theatrical inner monologue. Possession, divine not demonic, was often treated as a religious promotion, not a medical emergency. If a temple dancer started convulsing mid-rhythm, she wasn't rushed out by worried acolytes. She was applauded. Cybele had arrived, apparently, and had strong opinions about tympanum tempo. These trances were often achieved through a time-honored combo of repetitive drumming, rhythmic chanting, smoke inhalation, sleep deprivation, and wine with mysterious floaties in it. The result: sudden bouts of prophecy, dramatic gasping, and the occasional unplanned floor nap. Priests and priestesses alike were trained to host gods like Airbnb guests, welcoming them into their bodies during rites. This included changes in voice, posture, and a sudden urge to announce cryptic things while staring into a flame. In many shrines, it was just another Wednesday. To outsiders, it may have looked like a mass fainting spell. But within the temple, this was how messages from the gods were delivered. Sometimes the gods advised, sometimes they scolded, sometimes they demanded more cake offerings, which says a lot about ancient theology and ancient appetites. The trance wasn't always voluntary, either. There are accounts of the afflicted being taken by deities, often accompanied by shouting, shaking, and suspicious amounts of incense. Whether these were actual divine messages, or simply what happens when you inhale 4 hours of resinous smoke next to a flaming brazier is still debated. Of course, once the trance ended, the possessed party returned to normal, often looking slightly disoriented and very sweaty. The ritual concluded with applause, a sip of sacred wine, and possibly a nap behind a column, while someone else mopped up the sanctified drool. To modern eyes, divine possession might look like performance art meets heat stroke, but to ancient Romans, it was the pinnacle of religious experience. A moment when the divine pushed through the marble veneer of reality to drop a few cryptic life tips. You'd think death would be enough to stop someone from getting invited to a party. Not in Rome. The line between the living and the dead was more of a soft suggestion, like don't swim after eating, or maybe don't balance amphorae drunk. Romans didn't just respect the dead. They actively included them in social plans. This wasn't metaphorical. Families trekked to the necropolis during Parentalia and Feralia, lugging baskets of food, jugs of wine, and the general vibe of a tailgate if the tailgate were parked among marble steles. They'd sit by the tomb, eat, drink, and commune with the departed, which usually meant talking to the stone and hoping Grandma appreciated the olives. Many monuments had offering tables and libation tubes, little channels for pouring wine and milk so the dead could drink. Whether that meant spiritually or just enjoying the smell from the other side is unclear. Either way, Romans believed the departed could still enjoy food, drink, music, and a respectable bit of gossip. So naturally, they threw them parties. Music played, incense burned, libations flowed. Sometimes the living got drunk enough to cry, confess secrets, or accidentally sit on the sacrificial cakes. It was like a family reunion with fewer arguments and slightly more unguent. These gatherings weren't just acts of remembrance. They were mutually beneficial transactions. The living fed the dead. The dead, in theory, blessed the living in return. Good crops, protection, fewer nightmares involving wolves. Everyone won. Sometimes people even slept overnight, near tombs or practiced temple incubation hoping for dream visions from their departed loved ones or the occasional unsolicited advice from a retired accountant turned ghost. Stop lending money to your brother, the dream might say. And also the amulets go on the left. To modern sensibilities, this sounds macabre. To Romans, it was completely logical. The afterlife wasn't a goodbye. It was just a new address. And if great-uncle Gnaeus wanted to attend the party via divine osmosis through travertine, who were they to say no? For all the incense, holy trances, and sanctioned revelry, Roman merrymaking came with a price, and it usually arrived around sunrise with a pounding headache and a vague memory of yelling at a statue. Yes, even in a world where poppy was medicine and wine was breakfast adjacent, the morning after hit just as hard. Medical writers are suspiciously quiet on hangovers, probably because no one felt like scratching Latin when their head had been smitten by a god, but the remedies peek through. Texts describe pains of the head and suggest herbs, honey, vinegar, and sometimes just lying very still while pretending to commune with the lares. In advanced cases, ritual cleansing was recommended, which often involved a priest, a bucket of cold Tiber water, and possibly a stern lecture on temperature that nobody remembered hearing. The real trick, of course, was plausible deniability. If you danced shirtless in a temple or passed out in a tomb alcove, you didn't say, "I overdid it." You said, "I was overcome by the divine." It wasn't a blackout. It was a mystical encounter with Bacchus's laughter. Much more respectable. And for the truly unlucky, there was always purging not metaphorically, literally. Romans were fond of emetics, brisk concoctions designed to evacuate your sins from both ends. Imagine being handed a drink that tastes like regret and being told, "This will restore your balance." Moments later, your balance is definitely gone. The priests, of course, fared better. They had training. They had ritual authority. And most importantly, they had people to carry them home. Meanwhile, common revelers woke with laurel in their hair and sandal imprints on their faces, wondering whether they danced with a god or just someone very committed to the role. Still, no one swore off the next celebration because spiritual enlightenment, as it turns out, is addictive, especially when it comes with wine, smoke, and a mild chance of falling into a trance and yelling your neighbor's secrets in front of a statue. When ancient Romans prepared for death, they didn't just pack linens and a decent epitaph. They packed snacks and perfumes, and possibly a backup stash, just in case eternity got boring. Because if you thought the partying stopped after your funeral pyre cooled, think again. It just moved underground or into a neatly plastered columbarium. Tombs weren't silent, solemn places. They were carefully curated starter homes for the soul, complete with food, booze, and mood-enhancing herbal arrangements. The dead were interred or cremated with poppy garlands, wine jugs, incense pastilles, and the occasional sealed unguent jar, which archaeologists now eye with both reverence and mild suspicion. Take Pompeii, for example. When excavators pried open graves and niches, they didn't just find lamps and furniture. They found wine, oils, herbs, and what can only be described as the Roman version of a wellness kit. If a modern influencer were buried today, it would look disturbingly similar, minus the funerary masks. This wasn't just luxury. It was strategic. The soul or shade, if your fancy needed nourishment and stimulation in the afterlife. Eternal bliss wasn't going to maintain itself after all. So priests and undertakers made sure you were sent off with your spiritual comfort items, food offerings, sacred perfume, and a generous dose of whatever got you through long rites while pretending to be enlightened. Some tombs even include instructions to the dead on how to receive and enjoy these items in the afterlife. It's not enough to carry a poppy into eternity. Apparently, you also needed directions in case divine short-term memory was a thing. And let's not forget the coin for Karen, the opening of the eyes in memory, and the libation tubes that let the living pour wine, milk, and honey so the dead could sip with proper technique. Because it's hard to toast Bacchus with a closed mouth. All of this tells us one very clear thing. The Romans did not separate pleasure from piety. If something brought them closer to the gods in life, even if it was a soporific flower soaked in wine, it belonged in the tomb along with your amulets, your headrest, and possibly a starter pack of dreams. Rome gave the world roads, aqueducts, and eyeliner that could block out the sun. But it also perfected an unspoken truth of civilization. Sometimes the people running things are just high enough to think it's going well. Officially, the emperor was the earthly favorite of Jupiter, custodian of the Pax Deorum, the peace between gods and people. Unofficially, temple priests had the keys to the sacred stash, the incense budget, and the daily schedule of who gets to chant next to a brazier until they pass out. The religious elite weren't just spiritual guides. They were state-sanctioned pharmacists, supplying the population with everything from calming ointments to full-blown visionary experiences disguised as Holy Communion. If it smelled strong, tingled on contact, or made you speak in metaphor for 3 days, it probably came out of the priesthood's apothecary. And while emperors wore the crowns, it was the priests who knew how to blend mandrake with wine and not kill anyone. This gave them an enormous amount of soft power, not just in healing and ritual, but in managing the emotional and mystical tone of society. You didn't ask, "What's going on with the harvest?" You asked, "What did the high priest see in his trance last night?" Spoiler, it was usually an eagle and a lot of swirling gold light. Let's not forget the economic side. The temples were landowners, employers, and massive centers of cult supply. Incense didn't ship itself. Someone had to harvest resin, crush it, blend it, and whisper over it in sacred verse. So yes, religion was very holy, but it was also a well-oiled machine, one that ran on faith, herbs, and occasionally mind-altering doses of divine inspiration. In many ways, the question of who ruled Rome was less about crowns and more about who controlled the incense burners. Because if the gods spoke through visions, and the visions came after a priest sniffed something pungent in a sealed chamber, well, you do the math. In theory, ancient Rome was all about balance, justice, and order. In practice, if you were rich enough to afford a private mausoleum and someone to fan you while you digested, you also had access to the good stuff, the kind of narcotic rarities that didn't show up in the village clinic notes. Make no mistake, Roman society was a hierarchy, and mind-altering substances followed the same rules as everything else. Emperor at the top, goat-herder at the bottom, and everyone else politely sniffing dried garlands and pretending it was enough, while commoners got sour wine and maybe a whiff of temple incense if they leaned close enough. The elite were bathing in poppy oil and sipping spiked pomegranate wine out of gold-rimmed chalices. Some of the more potent substances mandrake, resinous blends laced with opium. Imported cannabis resins were likely restricted to ritual or medical use, which just happened to align perfectly with the daily schedules of court officials and high priests. Funny how that worked out. Take the emperor himself. The earthly ruler of a world-spanning republic turned empire couldn't be expected to process the metaphysical weight of ruling without a little help from the sacred pharmacopoeia. If his dreams were considered state messages from the gods, and sedating his insomnia with a psychoactive nightcap wasn't indulgence, it was national security. Even in death, the elite kept their stash close. Many tombs contain medicinal vials, incense cones, and wine jars with labels, so vague they may as well have read for ceremonial purposes only. One wonders if the gods actually required that much imported poppy resin, or if an Augustan just liked to keep his options open. The palace pharmacy never truly slept, either. Trust us. Meanwhile, the lower classes weren't exactly locked out of the experience. They just had to settle for the watered-down versions. Wine thick enough to chew, weak incense, and whatever passed for spiritual euphoria during an 18-hour shift paving roads. And when someone did get their hands on a forbidden substance without a permit, that was likely called witchcraft, impiety, or a very bad day to be a field laborer. After 14 chapters of sacred snorting, divine day drinking, and hallucinogenic healthcare, one might be tempted to ask, what does all this really say about ancient Rome? Well, for starters, it tells us they were brilliant at blending science, spirituality, and recreational chemistry into a single belief system. Pain relief and prophecy came from the same plant. Medicine and mysticism walked hand in hand, usually to the beat of a tympanum and the smell of something smoldering that definitely wasn't FDA approved. It also reveals just how much the ancients respected the power of altered states, not as escapism, but as a legitimate way to access insight, healing, and the occasional god with an ego and a flair for drama. Their rituals weren't just pageantry. They were controlled chemical theater with incense, chanting, and psychotropic wine for the caste and the strict gatekeeping of sacred substances. That's just the ancient version of putting wellness behind a paywall. The elite had their poppy spas and imported opium. Everyone else got lukewarm sour wine and an eye infection. Divine enlightenment was available, but only if you could afford the luxury tomb package with actual afterlife minibar. But perhaps the most revealing takeaway is this. Humans have always wanted to feel more, see more, and know more, especially if it involves lying down in a temple and not doing chores. The ancient Romans weren't that different from modern humans, meditating with essential oils or arguing about microdosing podcasts. They just wore fewer coal lines and took their hallucinations seriously. So, what does this mean for us? Well, maybe that our ancestors weren't primitive drug enthusiasts or eccentric spiritualists. Maybe they were just doing their best to navigate a confusing, beautiful, often painful world with the tools, rituals, and fragrant smoke they had. And if that journey to inner peace happened to involve wine, wild herbs, and a trance where you barked like a wolf, so be it. Florence late 1400s. Rome was bursting with art, intellect, and political intrigue, but also a very specific kind of madness, the obsession with beauty. And not just any beauty, Roman beauty. The kind that meant looking like polished marble, even if it killed you. Enter Cherusa, a luxurious silky white face paint made from, you guessed it, lead. Yes, actual lead. Women across Rome, Ostia, and beyond smeared this shimmering poison across their cheeks, foreheads, and décolletage to achieve that ultra-pale, ethereal look. Because in a world where tan skin meant laboring under the sun like a peasant, looking like a walking funerary statue was the ultimate flex. But this wasn't just a light dusting of powder. No, Cherusa was layered on like fresco plaster. Some women even slept in it, refusing to wash their faces, allowing the toxic compound to literally soak into their skin. The result, a radiant, ghostly glow right up until the sores appeared. And when they did, they just applied more lead to cover them. You know, like a Roman band-aid, one that guaranteed the wound would never heal. If the lead didn't get you, the mercury might cinnabar reds for lips and cheeks, minium for a pop of healthy color with a side of doom. Add in arsenic-laced depilatory tonics and vinegar face baths, and you had a full-blown chemical warfare routine marketed as elegance. And let's not forget the classism baked into every powdered pore. Noble women wanted skin untouched by sunlight or hardship, so the paler the better, even if it made them anemic, delirious, or eventually dead. Looking divine came at a divine cost. But perhaps the most ironic part, the women who could afford all this toxic luxury also had access to imported perfumes from Arabia, rosewater distillations, and camphor-laced tonics. They literally smelled like angels, while their skin peeled off in sheets. If you had a functioning pair of eyebrows in imperial Rome, you clearly weren't trying hard enough, or you were trying for the fashionable unibrow and missed. In the never-ending quest to resemble a panel painting or a particularly expensive egg, Roman women either plucked their brows into faint arcs or painted a single elegant line across the bridge with soot and antimony. A high, smooth forehead read noble and intelligent, so hairlines crept backward under the assault of bronze tweezers and pumice. This wasn't a one-time affair. It was routine maintenance, a weekly ritual of pain and precision. For stubborn hairs, recipes called for walnut oil, quicklime pastes, or the charming arsenic blend known as rusma to thin regrowth. Some even singed strays with lamp flames, because nothing says grace and refinement like lighting your face on fire. Eyebrows thin, arched, and barely visible, or deliberately joined, depending on the trend. Either way, a truly sophisticated woman controlled the shadow, a soft trace dusted in later with burnt cork or powdered charcoal, which sounds elegant until you realize it's smeared spectacularly in the Campanian heat. Meanwhile, body hair was deemed animalistic and unclean. Women removed it with vinegar and lime depilatories, sticky resins, and hot pitch. The mixture burned, but hey, it left the skin smooth until it didn't. And the scalp? Hair was wrangled into tight, rigid styles, elaborate braids, towers, and coils padded with false locks made from wool, horsehair, or somebody else's actual hair. Hello, imported Germanic blonde. Sometimes pieces were soaked in lye and sun-bleached to match the fashionable golden hue of the season. If it didn't match, no worries. Just throw a net or jeweled cap over it and pretend it did. Roman problem-solving at its finest. The irony, all this hair removal and sculpting happened with polished bronze mirrors that turned your face into a slightly wobbly moon. Most women styled by feel, with help from maids whose job demanded steady hands and zero passive aggression. One wrong tug, and your widow's peak became an accidental tonsure. Roman beauty was less about natural charm and more about strategic subtraction. Remove the brows, recede the hairline, remove common sense, all in the name of elegance. Once the face had been thoroughly powdered, plucked and poisoned, it was time to move on to the body. Specifically, squeezing it into shapes the human rib cage had no business aspiring to. Enter the Ramang bind. Equal parts fashion statement and orthopedic suggestion. No, not steel-boned corsets think strophium and fascia pectoralis. Long, unforgiving bands of linen wound flat around the torso, then cinched with a zona until the silhouette read, "Marble column with opinions." The goal was to create a smooth, rigid canvas that emphasized the bust and lengthened the figure. Because what's sexier than looking like a very elegant plank? The stiffening came from layers, tight wrappings, stitched cords, sometimes padded rolls laced and knotted by a patient maid. Getting into one required assistance, determination, and a surprising tolerance for losing peripheral vision. A fully dressed noblewoman was essentially an armored artichoke, layered, pinned, and strangely delicate. And bindings weren't just about looks. They were moral statements. A straight, upright posture signaled pudicitia and inner virtue. Slouching suggested moral laxity and possibly demonic influence from the Subura. So if you were well-bred, you stood straight, walked stiffly, and breathed in short, shallow gasps. Bonus points if you fainted gracefully in public. That just meant you were doing it right. Underneath, a sabacula of linen helped absorb sweat, because news flash, Rome in summer was not a place for heavy fabrics and no airflow. But elegance came first. Comfort came never. And yet, despite the discomfort, bindings had one major benefit. They held everything in place. Unlike modern brass that promised support and file for early retirement by noon, Roman stays offered the kind of structural reinforcement usually reserved for bridges. You could run, dance, or survive a fainting spell without anything shifting an inch. Of course, not everyone could afford architectural fashion. Working-class women went without tight stays, favoring looser bodices and breathable tunics. But among the elite, the wrappings were essential. You weren't fully dressed without them, just tragically undone. The worst part, you had to eat while wearing them. Which brings us to the next Roman fashion paradox. Feasting like royalty while trying not to split a seam or collapse from restricted airflow. In imperial Rome, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It extended all the way to the dinner couch, where fashion and food had an uneasy relationship. On the one hand, noble women were expected to attend lavish convivia and perform the social theater of feasting. On the other, they had to do it while trussed tight enough that their internal organs were basically roommates. Meals were grand affairs. Tables groaned under roasted peacock, stuffed dormoise, honey cakes, and fruit lacquered with syrup and a hint of show-off. But for upper-class women, actually eating was a delicate performance. You could nibble, you could sip, but you absolutely could not unhinge your jaw and go to town on a goose leg. That would have been barbaric and potentially dangerous given the cords biting your ribs. Instead, you were expected to take dainty bites, keep your back straight, and smile through the growing pressure in your chest. Sometimes the act of reclining prettily for hours and pretending to enjoy chilled eel and garum was enough to trigger a fainting spell, which frankly only added to the aesthetic. Pale, breathless, and collapsing into the arms of a handsome courtier. Tick. Of course, this polite self-starvation had limits. Many noble women were secretly ravenous by the time they reached their private rooms, where they could finally loosen the knots and devour a hidden stash of sweetmeats or leftover cheese. Yes, even Roman beauty queens had midnight snacks. They just couldn't admit it, and there were rules even for those. Certain foods were believed to affect the complexion. Cucumbers were discouraged. They made the skin watery. Wine was encouraged. It flushed the cheeks with color. Some ladies even sipped vinegar tonics to stay trim, because nothing says high fashion like arguing with your stomach lining. There was also the matter of digestion. In bindings, your stomach had nowhere to go. Women had to pace their eating carefully or risk indigestion, bloating, or, gods forbid, a very unladylike burp. The horror. So while men got to recline, drink heavily, and argue about Virgil, women mastered the art of elegant restraint, eating just enough to seem sociable, but never enough to ruin the line of the stola. Once the face was painted, the hair plucked, the bindings tightened, and the food politely nibbled, it was time to smell expensive. In imperial Rome, your scent wasn't just a finishing touch. It was a social weapon. A noblewoman's fragrance was as carefully curated as her ancestry, and failing to smell like imported luxury was basically a scandal. The Roman nose had standards. Common folk might reek of garlic, goats, and existential dread, but the elite wafted through atria and basilicas, trailing clouds of rose, myrrh, spikenard, cassia, and saffron. If you passed a matron and didn't feel mildly intoxicated by her aura, she wasn't trying hard enough. Perfume was big business. Italy blended and bottled, but the most coveted ingredients came from far afield. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from Ethiopia, cinnamon from India and Sri Lanka, balsam from Judea liquid status in little glass unguentaria. It was outrageously expensive and wildly fashionable, the Roman equivalent of dabbing yourself with designer altar smoke. And these scents weren't just for pulse points. Oils soaked into gloves and veils, were stitched into dress linings, and dabbed onto handkerchiefs. A lady could flutter dramatically whenever someone less hygienic came too close, which was often. Streets were filthy. Baths helped, but not daily. Perfume wasn't a luxury. It was armor. For the ambitious, scent layering was essential. A rinse of rose water, a dusting of violet, a nard oil at the temples and wrists, then a final rain of whatever concoction your perfumer swore would make senators sigh and rivals faint. Sachets tucked in pleats, pomum-like scent balls on belts approach with caution. I smell of cinnamon and judgment. Of course, the potions weren't always benign. Some blends hid turpentine bite or tinctures so strong they triggered headaches, nausea, or theatrical swoons. One wrong recipe and you went from seductive to insufferable. Still, the right fragrance opened doors or at least noses. A woman who smelled divine had power to entrance, distract, or simply survive a crowd of unwashed poets. If Roman beauty was a battlefield, fashion was the armor, and the forum was its glittering war zone. Cloth didn't whisper. It shouted lineage and bank balance. Silk shimmered from the east. Fine linen and soft wool draped like poured light. Purple borders, clavy, broadcast rank at 30 paces. Wearing layered finery in August? A power move. You were overheated, yes, but also important. Patterns strutted, two woven vines, key meanders, sprinklings of gold thread, and we're not talking subtle accents. These were garments that could double as portable altars. The more intricate the weave, the more time and money it devoured, which meant the more smugly you could nod at another woman's inferior hem. Trims were a competitive sport. Jeweled fibulae, tassels, beadwork. Segmenta appliques you could mix and match like today's designer handbags. Embroidered, puffed, slashed dash-in layers for the theatrical. Pearl-studded some wardrobes needed their own storerooms, and occasionally their own servants. Colors were coded, too. Deep Tyrian purple from Murex shells, blazing saffron, madder crimson, indigo blues pigments, so costly they were locked away like treasure. Only the rich could afford these hues, and sumptuary laws in places like Rome tried and failed to restrict certain colors to the elite. Think the Lex Appia and its persnickety hairs, too. But laws were boring. Garments were not. Even the underlayers were ornate. Shifts were trimmed with lace-like edging. Undertunics peeked out in silken flashes. And girdles belt-like accessories weren't just decorative. Some were studded with gems and hid pockets for perfume, tablets, or possibly revenge notes. But all this fashion came at a price, literally. A single stola could cost more than a year's wages for a craftsman. And yet, Noble women didn't just own these gowns. They needed them. Every social event was a stage, and every outfit a statement. Wearing the same thing twice, social suicide. Roman fashion didn't stop at the ankle, though in fairness, no one was really supposed to see your ankles. Modesty dictated that a woman's feet be kept decently hidden beneath layers of dyed wool and silk, which was a pity considering how completely ridiculous Roman footwear often was. Let's start with the cothurnus, the most theatrical shoe ever borrowed from the stage. Cothurnoi were essentially high platform soles. Think Greek tragedy sandals crossed with stilts. Designed to keep hems above street filth and to add gravitas, they turned alleys into balancing acts. Over time, function gave way to fashion, and the platforms got taller. Much taller. Some were absurdly high. Yes, that's not a typo. High. Wearing them required balance, training, and frequently a servant on each arm. Walking unaided was both a physical feat and a social risk. If you fell, you didn't just lose your dignity. You might take out half the dinner party with you. In Rome, the heights weren't always as extreme, but the urge to tower still trickled down. Wealthy women wore delicate pointed slippers, often of dyed leather or velvet, embroidered with silk thread and lined with fur. These were indoor shoes. Outdoors, you strapped on pattens, wooden or cork platforms buckled under your slippers to protect them from the street. A practical solution, unless you tripped and shattered your kneecaps on paving stones. Foot binding wasn't a thing in Italy, but the pressure to have dainty, narrow feet absolutely was. Shoes were pointed, narrow, and not built for actual walking. But who needed to walk when you could glide from litter to atrium, leaving a trail of crushed flower petals and broken arches? And then there were the stockings. Women wore finely knit adones made of silk or wool, tied at the knee with ribbons. These ribbons were sometimes scented, because if someone glimpsed your shin, you wanted to smell fabulous. Of course, lower-class women wore simpler shoes, sturdy leather for labor, clogs for wet work. But the noble class treated footwear like a secret weapon, unseen, impractical, and incredibly expensive. All of it reinforced a single message. Real ladies didn't walk. They floated, they glided, they suffered gracefully and in style. After hours of being powdered, plucked, wrapped, perfumed, stuffed, and platformed, what came next? That's right, dancing. Because nothing completes the Roman beauty ritual like trying to glide across a polished marble floor in 20 pounds of fabric and 2 inches of breathable lung space. Courtly dances were serious business. These weren't your carefree tavern reels. No, elite dances were slow, elegant, and excruciatingly choreographed. Every step was rehearsed, every movement symbolic. The wrong foot placement could imply social ineptitude. A misstep, scandalous. You might as well shout, "I own nothing," in Tyrian purple, and run barefoot into a fountain. For noble women, dancing was a test of composure. The most popular forms, processional steps and measured turns, required gliding in precise patterns, keeping your gaze modest, and never under any circumstance breathing through your mouth. That was considered undignified, which is unfortunate because bindings did not allow for deep breaths. Every leap was a calculated gamble against passing out cold. And yet, it was crucial. A woman's grace on the floor was as vital to her reputation as her dowry. Parents hired dance tutors the way modern influencers hire lighting designers. You learned how to turn, how to bow, how to fan yourself, just enough to be mysterious, but not so much that you looked sweaty. The goal was to radiate effortless control, even as your shoes blistered and your ribs whimpered. There was also the matter of social strategy. Dancing offered rare opportunities to interact briefly with eligible men. Ringed fingers touched for a moment. Eyes met during a bow. Perfumes mingled. It was flirtation with footnotes. But say too much, move too boldly, or heaven forbid, laugh. You risked ruining your entire aesthetic of pious elegance. Meanwhile, the background noise of every court event was a choir of judgment. Other women critiqued your gown, your hairstyle, your posture. Servants whispered, tutors fretted, and all the while you had to maintain the illusion that none of it mattered. But it did. A clumsy turn or an off-rhythm curtsy could haunt you for weeks. So you danced, you smiled, you endured, and when the music finally stopped, you excused yourself to repowder your sweat-streaked cherusa before round two. The guests had departed. The oil lamps guttered into sooty crescents, and the Roman noblewoman divine, dazzling, and delicately dying inside finally made it back to her cubiculum. But sleep? Not yet. First came the imperial version of the night routine. Spoiler, it was less self-care and more controlled deterioration. Step 1, the unmasking. Out came the linen cloths, rose water, and raw egg whites. The lead-based cherusa had to be gently lifted, not because it was delicate, but because scrubbing too hard would take skin with it. Many women used a mix of almond oil and vinegar to coax off the layers, hoping the complexion underneath wasn't too ravaged. Spoiler, it usually was. Then came the hair, or what was left of it. Carefully, the pins and borrowed braids were uncoiled. Any adhesive used to anchor forehead pieces had to be dissolved with herbal tonics. Ladies hoped the quicklime blends they'd used for hair removal earlier in the week hadn't left bald patches. No pressure. Next, the bindings unlaced. A spiritual experience, usually involving gasps, groans, and possibly an audible crunch as ribs remembered their original layout. You could finally breathe, not deeply, but enough to sigh in relief and maybe whisper, "Never again," for the 100th time. The feet were peeled out of slippers, revealing the crushed remains of what used to be toes. If you were lucky, a servant brought a basin of warm water with lavender or rosemary to soak them. If not, you just stared at your feet and wondered if you'd ever feel joy again. Finally, you were rubbed down with sweet oils. Or, if you were particularly devout or paranoid, an alchemical tonic promising to preserve your youth. Never mind that it smelled like old copper and probably contained powdered beetles. Beauty is pain, also possibly pestilence. And then, at last, the lamp was snuffed. Not with a huff still too improper, but a delicate puff like you were apologizing to the flame. You lay back, hairline 2 fingers farther back than it was last year. Skin slightly more ghostly than the day before. Lungs recovering from fascia trauma. But tomorrow you'd do it all again. Because in Imperial Rome, beauty wasn't just a look. It was a lifestyle. A full-time, high-stakes performance with no intermission. And the audience? Everyone. Before they were linked to prisons and back-alley parlors. Tattoos in Rome carried a more complicated identity, rooted in shame, duty, and sometimes devotion. Long before the High Empire, Roman marks, stigmata, were burned or inked into criminals' faces and slaves' arms to brand them as property and outcasts. But by the 1st century CE, those crude symbols bled into something more intricate. Unit badges, cult emblems, and talismanic marks that felt like spiritual armor. In Rome, the order was rigid. Class divisions were clear. Senators had purple. Merchants had margins. Everyone else, they had restrictions. Magistrates and morals laws policed fabrics and jewelry, reserving luxury for the elite. But human nature always finds a loophole. For the common man dockworkers, sailors, gladiators, Vigil's ink became a way to reclaim beauty, status, and identity beneath the tunic where no censor could scowl. If you couldn't wear purple on the outside, why not wear it on your skin? And so marks flourished underground, hidden beneath plain tunics, but revealed in bathhouses, festivals, and moments of intimacy. These weren't random doodles. They were stories. Sleeves of eagles and wolves, back panels of thunderbolts and tridents, laurels, dolphins, Fortuna wheels, Medusa heads, Hercules club, and little SPQR monograms tucked where only steam and candlelight could find them. Each emblem carried meaning. A dolphin swimming upward promised safe journeys. An eagle between the shoulders meant power and protection. These motifs weren't chosen on a whim. They were earned sometimes one painful inch at a time, and the process was brutal. No machines, no antiseptic creams. Artisans with bone or bronze needles hand-poked lampblack and wine soot beneath the skin, sometimes with copper greens or iron reds, tap-tap-tapping to a rhythm older than the Aventine. Sessions lasted hours. Big pieces could take years, but the result a living mural that turned skin into testimony. Yet despite their richness, tattoos skated the edge of taboo. The law and good taste placed ink on slaves, criminals, and soldiers. Patricians pretended to faint, so body art thrived in the shadows, respected by some, feared by others, and conveniently invisible at the Senate door. In imperial Rome, where tenements stacked like tinder and oil lamps licked every stairwell, fires were constant and devastating. Senators might rule the laws, but when your insula caught, it was the vigils who saved your life. These weren't firefighters as we imagine today. No hoses, no retardant suits. Hooks, axes, buckets, siphons, and raw nerve. Their job wasn't just to douse flames. It was to tear down adjoining roofs and make fire breaks before the blaze leapt the alley. That meant clambering onto groaning beams and dismantling homes by hand while sparks fell like summer hail. Naturally, a culture of bravado, toughness, and brotherhood formed. Central to that culture were marks. Broad panels of ink, a cohort number, a wolf, a Neptune crest for the river squads became badges of honor. Not vanity, armor, and the pain? Part of the point. Sit for hundreds of hours while needles pepper your back and you're ready to face a furnace. The designs weren't decoration. They were proof of fearlessness, commitment, and pain endured for the good of the watch. Some cohorts even shared themes. Whole teams carrying matching eagles across their shoulders or coordinated waves and laurels spiraling their arms. Not gang craft solidarity, brotherhood forged through smoke and tile dust. But it wasn't respectable. Tattoos were still frowned upon by magistrates, vulgar on free skins, wasteful to scolds, especially for public servants. So the vigils wore their ink beneath their clothes, revealed only in steamy baths or feast day processions, when local heroics bought them a temporary pass. In the Subura, they were admired. On the Palatine, quietly feared. To some, the marks screamed danger. To others, devotion. Beyond the watches and work crews, another tribe embraced the painful elegance of ink, the gamblers, rogues, and thrill-seekers of Rome's floating world. Dice dens, theaters, riverfront taverns, the city within the city that drifted between lamps and dawns. There, tattoos were a language of risk, identity, and rebellion. Many were aleators and card sharpers who roamed with cups, knucklebones, and an unnerving talent for lightening a legionary's purse. They had no charter at first, only a code loyalty, silence, toughness. Pushed to the margins by censors and respectability, they reclaimed dignity with ink, turning a narrow life into meaning one needle prick at a time. Their tattoos were bold, provocative, and unapologetically visible in the right settings. Eagles, gladiators, gods of fortune, and snakes coiled across their torsos. These weren't the quiet, contemplative marks of philosophers or the civic pride of firefighters. These were power statements, visual declarations that said, I don't follow your rules. I live by my own. Many designs referenced heroes from epic and stage Hercules wrestling monsters, Aeneas shouldering his father, stage rogues from Atellan farce, even mythic rebels who thumbed their noses at authority. The more outrageous the figure, the more admired the tattoo. It wasn't just skin-deep symbolism. It was branding in a society where nobody handed you a name unless you fought for it. And yet, despite their outsider status, these men were crucial to the underground economy. They lent money, kept order in rough taverns and theaters, and built early proto-collegia that were half guild, half rumor. Their tattoos became both badge and warning: loyalty within, danger without. Ink shops flourished in this world, not always marked with signs, but known through whispers and connections. The stigmators, the tattoo masters, became minor legends. Their work was murmured about in bathhouses and behind wine counters. To be inked by a famous hand was an honor. To endure the hours of stabbing pain, a show of grit. For gamblers and rogues, stigma was more than art. It was an identity carved in pain, proudly worn in a city that had no place for them. Though tattooing in Rome is often framed as a masculine code for slaves, soldiers, and dock workers, women also left their mark quietly, tenderly, and rebelliously beneath layers of wool and propriety. Rarely recorded by official pens, female tattoos existed at the edges, a secret blossom, a name, a sign that meant everything to two people and nothing to a censor. In many cases, these tattoos were intimate, romantic, personal. Unlike the great mythic panels worn by their male counterparts, women's ink was smaller, discreet, emotionally charged. Lovers pricked each other's names where only a confidant might see, inside the upper arm, near the collarbone, along the hip bone. Romans called them tituli amoris, love marks. A popular vow etched in neat letters ran, Tibi vitam comeo, I entrust you with my life. More than a promise, it was a declaration of surrender written in pain. Men sometimes carried the same lines, proof of mutual fidelity beyond what any contract or dowry could guarantee. This kind of tattooing found a home in the city's floating world, lantern-lit streets of Subura and the river quarter where courtesans and entertainers reigned. Among high-ranking companions, ink could be a tool of seduction. A teasing symbol, visible only when a robe slipped just so, became part of the mystique. It granted the illusion of intimacy, as if a client glimpsed something forbidden. In reality, the same little sigil might have worked its soft magic on dozens, each convinced it was a private secret. Elsewhere, the needle mapped heartbreak and betrayal. A courtesan might sear or slash a name after a lover vanished, turning passion into scar. Others commissioned cover work, vines swallowing letters, waves washing memories away. And for women outside the pleasure quarters, tattoos could be acts of quiet rebellion. Peasant wives in the hills, fishers at Ostia, or spouses of tattooed men sometimes followed suit, inspired by the artistry or the solidarity. They risked whispers, but wore their ink privately under tunics as declarations of autonomy. Respectable pens condemned such marks, especially on women, but the needles wrote a hidden narrative: love, agency, pain born. A story official histories never bothered to set on wax. Behind every breathtaking back panel, every thunderbolt, laurel, and tragic hero, etched in flesh stood the unsung artisans of Rome, the stigmators, masters of the needle. They worked quietly in tucked-away corners of the city, anonymous rooms above bathhouses, back rooms of barbershops, or lamplit flats that smelled of incense, oil, and lampblack. There were no painted plaques, no customer reviews, just reputation passed by word of mouth and inked skin. Becoming a stigmator was no casual decision. It took years of training, usually an apprenticeship under a hard-eyed master. The tools were basic: wooden handles bound with clusters of bronze or iron needles at the tip, dipped into a thick black atramentum made from lampblack and gum. The technique was painstakingly slow and deeply painful. Needles were driven rhythmically into the skin by hand, sometimes tapped with a light stick until the design took. This perpunctuous method demanded steady hands, infinite patience, and the concentration of a monk. But stigmators weren't just craftsmen. They were storytellers, historians, psychologists. A good master had to know not only how to tattoo, but what to tattoo. Every emblem carried meaning. A laurel fading into waves, fortune's rise and fall. A lion climbing a crag, bravery against impossible odds. The client might bring a request, but the stigmator would decide placement, balance, the soul of the piece. Clients returned over and over, sometimes for years, to complete their full suit. A bodyscape stretching shoulder to thigh, across the back, down the arms, often stopping just above the wrist and neckline. That wasn't random. Marks had to hide beneath daily clothing to avoid trouble with magistrates. Some masters signed their work, not visibly, but secretly in a serpent's coil, or tucked in the curls of a Medusa. Subtle signatures became badges of pride, recognizable only to those in the know. Despite the intimacy of the craft, stigmators lived with 1 foot outside society. Their clientele were vigils, sailors, gladiators, courtesans people beyond the elite. So the artists lived at the edge too, revered by the underground, invisible to the powerful. Roman ink wasn't just something you wore. It was something you survived. Every line, every shade, every drop of color came at a price, measured in hours of stillness and days of aching flesh. In Rome, the pain wasn't a drawback. It was the point. The hand-poked method was brutal by design. The master dipped the clustered needles into atramentum, then tapped them rhythmically into the skin. Slow, infuriatingly slow. A single outline could take hours. A great back panel might require years of regular sessions, each a half-day ordeal. No numbing creams, no mercy. Only the metronome of tapping and the raw sting of every puncture. And the pain was symbolic. It separated dilettantes from the devoted. It was a trial of will, patience, and mind. Clients didn't just receive tattoos. They earned them. Enduring those sessions became a badge of honor, traded in quiet pride at bathhouses and taverns. Firefighters said the agony steeled their courage. Gamblers took it as a test of luck and loyalty. Courtesans and lovers embraced it as proof of feeling. For some, punishment. For others, purification. There was a spiritual dimension, too. Enduring pain felt like stoic discipline, or a mystery called fast. Isis and Mithras themes were common not just for their beauty, but for their talk of suffering, rebirth, and enlightenment. With each session, a person didn't just near completion. They neared transformation. And there were rules. You didn't flinch. You didn't cry out. Move, and you ruined the line or earned a scolding. Only the most serious finished a full suit often, with a deliberate chest window, leaving a pectoral panel bare so the robe could fall open without scandal. In a world where the elite wore silk and status, the tattooed wore pain and permanence. Every inch of a Roman suit told a story. These weren't random menu picks. They were mythologies mapped onto the body, carefully chosen symbols with layers of meaning encoded in swirling ink from shoulder to ankle. Take the dolphin, for example. Not just decorative. A dolphin swimming upstream promised safe return and stubborn joy. Serpents coiling a spine weren't mere menace. They were guardians, apotropaic and wise, tied to healing and the earth's deep currents. A serpent across the back wasn't meant to intimidate. It was meant to shield, a quiet presence between your skin and the world. Bees signified bravery with elegance. Lions stood for ferocity and resolve. Waves marked life's unpredictability. Gorgons and shades were warnings, cautionary tales, inked as reminders of dangers lurking in both street and spirit. Many works depicted full scenes from epic and myth. Labors, shipwrecks, rescues, betrayals, divine interventions. Popular subjects included the Rho Gamma Omicron, Nu Alpha Tau Alpha Iota, Aeneas shouldering his father, Hercules in mid-trial. These stories resonated with the tattooed class rebels, protectors, misfits who didn't fit the senatorial ideal, but still lived by a code. Cult figures appeared too. particularly the stern ones. Nemesis with wheel and bridle, rope to bind, blade to cut through folly. Mithras interoctony, fixing the cosmos with a knife and a calm stare. Wearing them was like carrying a spiritual bodyguard who didn't mind getting practical. But not all meanings were universal. Placement, size, direction mattered. A lion climbing upward spoke of ambition. Downward could whisper caution. Even the order in which sections were inked said something about your road. The symbols were sacred, private, powerful. In a city where words could betray you, tattoos became the most honest speech. As the empire shifted, the vibrant underground culture of ink, once a quiet code among work crews, vigils, and gamblers, collided with changing morals and official nerves. What had been admired in steam-fogged baths and wine-sweet rooms grew tangled with fear as marks showed up on rougher company and louder nights. The turning point came when authorities tightened their grip on public behavior. Tattooing, long tolerated in the shadows, acquired a sharper stigma as it became more visible among collegia, with reputations that made magistrates twitch. Men bold enough to wear full suits openly also proved bold enough to organize, and the stain spread. Censors didn't care whether your serpent meant wisdom or your dolphin meant perseverance. To them, ink meant one thing: trouble. Edicts followed. No marks on freeborn faces, no branding the living image of a citizen. Later, broader bans on stigmatizing skins. Enforcement varied, as enforcement does, but shops ducked lower underground. Stigmators worked in secret. Clients booked with code words. Artists learned to bury lines beneath lines, hide initials in curls, blur edges to fool a bored inspector. The stigma wasn't just legal, it was social. A visibly tattooed body could be turned away at certain baths, barred from shrines, or rejected by a respectable family's gatekeeper with a very polite no. Tattooed skin became taboo. The craft, once a badge of bravery or devotion, was recast as vulgar, dangerous, even evil. But the ink didn't vanish. It went deeper under the skin and under the radar. For every crackdown, there was a new design, a new hiding place, a new client willing to suffer for something that mattered. Romang ink didn't die. It coiled under tunics and waited. As the empire shifted into the Christian centuries, bishops and emperors polished Rome's image to look civilized, orderly, and, crucially, unmarked. In this new moral mirror, tattoos had no place. Stigma, with all its underground prestige, was declared a stain. Edicts multiplied. Marking the body of the freeborn was not just criminal. It was embarrassing, savage, shameful. Respectable eyes widened at full back panels glimpsed in steamy baths. Rome, eager to be seen as disciplined, shoved ink deeper underground than ever. And yet, even as citizens were scolded, tattoos became a curiosity for others. Sailors from every sea, mercenaries, and wanderers docking at Ostia sought out stigmators to take home a slice of Roman skin craft. Dolphins for safe voyages, eagles for swagger. Ironically, the very art Rome tried to bury was preserved by the very foreigners whose respect it craved. Still, the tradition didn't die. Masters adapted. They changed their clientele, dimmed their lamps, and kept the hand-tap method alive. Lineages survived in whispers, father to daughter, uncle to nephew, master to one careful apprentice. Techniques, symbols, and tools passed in low voices under oil-smoked ceilings. In late antiquity, ink tangled with rougher brotherhoods. Full suits hid beneath wool and togas, badges of loyalty and fear in the criminal underworld. Once again, tattoos meant pain, honor, secrecy, this time with less poetry than the vigils and more knife and laurel. The art remained. The public looked away. Even now, the stigma lingers. Despite modern fascination, plenty of doors still twitch at visible ink. Baths, gyms, even certain shrines revive old rules. The fear of bad company endures, even when the serpent on your shoulder is harmless. But tides shift. Young artists reclaim Roman ink not as rebellion, but as heritage. Museums conserve needles and pigment cakes. Scholars finally praise the craft. A new generation asks, why be ashamed of our own skin? In a culture built on layers of cloth, of meaning, of silence, ink remains the most honest speech Rome ever hid. In Rome, discussing sex bluntly was gauche, unless you wrapped it in respectable Latin and filed it under philosophy, medicine, or household management. Enter the marriage handbook, a strange little genre where moralists, physicians, and stoic uncles explained how decent couples were supposed to get busy strictly for proles, the production of heirs. Less 50 Shades, more 46 permissible occasions in compliance with the household gods. Scrolls with titles like On Marriage or On Duties disguised what they were, detailed timetables for when, how, and why spouses might engage, complete with omens, calendars, and lists of no-go days. Spoiler, there were a lot of no-go days. Unholy days? Improper. During certain festivals? Don't even think about it. The night before sacrifices? The gods are listening. Add fear of ill omens and a nosy augur, and it's a wonder Rome ever replenished the census. The guides also prescribed a mindset. Joy was suspicious, passion risky, love acceptable, so long as it didn't become enthusiasm. Wives were urged to be modest and quiet. Husbands warned not to let desire outpace dignity. The ideal was spiritual harmony, with just enough corporeal cooperation to produce an infant and nothing else. And yet these scrolls sold, especially to the very moralists who wrote them. Some even divided positions into natural versus unnatural, with face-to-face, lights dimmed by virtue, deemed astral, and anything athletic regarded as a short path to scandal. Educated Romans, of course, read between the lines. These were among the few respectable texts that acknowledged the topic at all, so people devoured them, not always for pious reasons. A marriage manual on the shelf was unimpeachable. What you dog-eared was your business. Right beside the household homilies, another kind of object circulated less wholly, more illustrated. On the surface, scientific marvels, medical diagrams, anatomical waxes, and papyrus sketches borrowed from Greek schools. But for anyone with half an imagination and a locking chest, they carried extracurricular appeal, especially when the female form appeared. Rome loved the body as art, and the body as science, often at the same time. Venus in polished marble, then a physician's papyrus noting muscles with a stylus. Officially educational, unofficially. Well, not every viewer stood there for the lymphatic notes. Studios and scriptoriums leaned into the double draw. Idealized nudes for study, precise lines softened by a sculptor's eye. It was a Roman loophole. If you wanted to look at naked people, you pretended to care deeply about tendons. Not all forbidden pages wore lab coats. Some didn't bother to hide. Alongside duty-bound marriage talk came a different scroll for private collections. Half etiquette, half soft seduction. Written for well-bred readers who wanted to flirt without falling straight into infamia. These manuals reveled in ambiguity. Tips on courtship, lettercraft, and salon talk, all under the pretense of polishing virtue. Between the lines, innuendo. They taught the art of the glance, the science of sighing in someone's direction, the choreography of hand placement during a slow, stately turn. Sample dialogues offered chaperone-safe compliments for a walk in the peristyle, or praise for a lady's lyre without scandal. And then there was the masterclass. Epistolary romance imagined letter exchanges between noble lovers with names like Cornelius and Fabia. Ostensibly models of propriety, many missives drifted suspiciously close to fantasy. You could practically hear the tunics rustle and the gloves slide off ever so politely. For every crackdown, there was a new design, a new hiding place, a new client willing to suffer for something that mattered. Roman ink didn't die. It coiled like a serpent and waited. As the empire slid into Christian centuries, rulers and bishops were eager to present the world as civilized, orderly, and most importantly unmarked. In this polished image of a purified Rome, tattoos had no place. Stigma, with all its underground prestige, was declared a stain. Edicts multiplied. Marking the freeborn body became not just illicit, but embarrassing, savage, shameful. Respectable brows shot skyward at full back panels glimpsed through bathhouse steam, and Rome, desperate to look dignified, pushed ink farther underground than ever. Yet even as citizens were scolded, tattoos turned into a curiosity for outsiders. Sailors, mercenaries, and wanderers, docking at Ostia, hunted down stigmators to carry home a slice of Roman craft dolphins for safe voyages. Eagles for swagger. Ironically, the very ark Rome tried to bury survived in the hands of the very foreigners whose esteem it craved. Still, the tradition didn't die. Masters adapted. They shifted clients, dimmed lamps, and kept the hand tap alive. Lineages survived in whispers, parent to child, master to one careful apprentice, techniques and symbols passed beneath oil-smoked ceilings. In late antiquity, ink tangled with tougher brotherhoods. Full suits hid beneath wool and togas, badges of loyalty and fear in the city's shadow economy. Once again, tattoos meant pain, honor, secrecy, this time with less laurel and more knife. The art endured. The public looked away. Even now, the stigma lingers. Despite modern fascination, plenty of doors still twitch at visible ink. Baths, gyms, even a few shrines quietly revive old rules. Fear of bad company endures, even when the serpent on your shoulder is just a story. But tides shift. Young artists reclaim Roman ink not as rebellion, but as heritage. Museums conserve needles and pigment cakes. Scholars finally praise the craft. A new generation asks, why be ashamed of our own skin? In a culture built on layers of cloth, of meaning, of silence, ink remains the most honest speech Rome ever hid. In Rome, speaking plainly about sex was gauche, unless you wrapped it in respectable Latin and filed it under medicine, morals, or household management. Enter the marriage handbook, a strange little genre where moralists, physicians, and stoic uncles outlined how decent couples were supposed to get busy strictly for heirs. Less 50 shades, more 46 permissible occasions under the kindly gods. Scrolls with titles like on marriage or on duties disguised their purpose. Timetables for when, how, and why spouses might engage, complete with omens, calendars, and lists of no-go days. Spoiler, there were many. Festival eves? Improper. On offerings mornings? The gods are listening. Add dread of bad auspices and a nosy augur, and it's a wonder the census ever grew. The guides also prescribed a mood. Joy was suspicious, passion risky, love acceptable if it never sprinted. Wives were urged to be modest and quiet. Husbands warned not to let desire outrun dignity. The ideal was spiritual harmony with just enough corporeal cooperation to produce an infant and nothing else. And yet these scrolls sold especially to the very moralists who copied them. Some even sketched out natural versus unnatural angles, with face-to-face under a mantle deemed celestial, and anything athletic treated as a quick path to scandal. Educated Romans read between the lines. These were among the few respectable texts that acknowledged the topic at all. So people devoured them, not always for pious reasons. A handbook on the shelf was unimpeachable. What you dog-eared was your business. Right beside the household homilies circulated another object less holy, more illustrated. On the surface, scientific marvels, medical diagrams, marble studies, and wax models. But for anyone with half an imagination and a locking chest, they had extracurricular appeal, especially when the female form appeared. Rome adored the body as art and the body as science, often at the same time. Venus in polished stone, and a physician's papyrus mapping muscles with a stylus. Officially educational. Unofficially, let's just say not every viewer was there for bile ducts. Studios leaned into the double-draw idealized nudes for study, with a sculptor's eye smoothing the edges. The perfect loophole. If you wanted to look at naked people, pretend to care deeply about tendons. The dance between duty and desire wasn't limited to manuals. Poets played both sides. Some handbooks tucked miniature epigrams and riddles into margins cultured enough to pass, suggestive enough to spark. Romans adored double meanings, and love poets delivered in shapely couplets. Grooming notes crept in too. Ovid, with a straight face, suggested clean nails and bright teeth so kisses didn't scratch or offend. Other writers whispered breath tips, avoid onions, before whispers of affection. Practical, if not exactly spiritual. The texts never depicted the act. They circled its slow-burn tension through shutters, fans, and veils. For young nobles stuck between arranged matches and stern codes, these scrolls were escape hatches, legal to own, risky to understand. Meanwhile, under pillows lay the contraband syllabus. Ovid's Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, was a Roman classic turned perennial scandal, a step-by-step guide to seduction from theater spotting to a dab of jealousy for spice. Witty, elegant, and entirely immoral, by certain standards hence irresistible. Copies lived behind pious volumes, rebound in plain covers. Margins in some survivors sport helpful notes, like try this at circus games, or worked on Calpurnia. A Peleus golden ass slipped past scolds with a mythic plot, then swerved into transformations, lust, and one very talkative donkey. Officially allegory, unofficially toga-clad mischief. Greek anthologies and imported verse added spice, some hinting politely that pleasure could polish the soul. Booksellers played the game. Officially, law, grammar, philosophy. Unofficially, a wink and a discreet coin bought entry to an armorium labeled medical curiosities or private readings. Censors called it sin. Merchants called it revenue. Fine houses commissioned Lux copies gold leaf, pretty putty, and occasionally illustrations of things putty should not witness. People didn't just read these books. They experienced and shared at dinners, whispered over at masquerades, scolded by moralists, quoted by poets. Publicly, everyone swore it was for Latin practice. Privately, their bookmarks told the truth. Rome had no index in the churchly sense, but it had teeth. Moral laws and imperial nerves could make a reader's life interesting. Augustus scowled at wayward verses and exiled Ovid. Tiberius and Domitian swatted astrologers and philosophers. A historian too frank might find his scrolls misplaced. Possession of a saucy volume could mean questions, confiscation, a vow to behave. Printers didn't exist yet, but copyists did, and the gray market thrived. A clean edition for public eyes, a hotter one for private hands, a false title slip for the anxious. One notorious copy of Apuleius circulated under sermons of an exemplary orator. Plot twist indeed. Private libraries sprouted traps and tricks, false bindings, hollow boxes, mirrored cupboards, espionage with a blush. Women proved especially deft couriers, underestimated by scolds, overqualified for subterfuge. They borrowed, copied, circulated under the pretense of devotional reading. A matron might keep a neat Ovid tucked behind Lives of Virtuous Romans. Another translated a saucy epigram for language practice. Publicly, censure. Privately, the page turned carefully. Behind high walls away from gossips and busybodies, Roman women had access to their own shelves, and some of them were anything but tame. Villas weren't only nurseries of chastity and thrift. They were also schools of literacy, curiosity, and yes, bottled thunder. Many daughters landed in careful households, not by whim, but by family strategy. Too costly to marry grandly, better to polish quietly. The result, Minds trained, hearts caged, enter the cabinet. On the surface, piety and propriety. Underneath, marginalia curling in the corners, lines underlined with suspicious zeal, and in some cases, hand-copied poems tucked discreetly between household prayers. One grand lady in Campania was chided for rendering Ovid's tricks into the vernacular for education. Others drafted their own verses coded, aching, bright with longing. Scholars suspect some anonymous salon lyrics were penned not by public bells, but by cloistered minds with private ink. Medicine provided another loophole. Households kept anatomical notes for care, since women often tended the sick. But as we've noticed, anatomy seldom stayed purely clinical. One dignified matron argued to keep her illustrated manual because it instructed the young against temptation, which is one way to title it. The authorities tried to patrol what entered those rooms, but literacy breeds autonomy, and autonomy breeds detours. Forbidden's pages moved hand to hand, memorized, recopied, marked with sly ribbons. For some, the scent of vellum and ink outpersuaded incense. In the quiet after lamps were dimmed, a young wife might raise a flame and open a book, not scripture, but something warmer. A poem, a tale, a stolen fragment of a world she might never touch but could imagine. Sometimes the most forbidden texts weren't about lust. They were about breathing. Not every prescribed work sat on a shelf. Some hid in aprons, slept under floor tiles, or lived as whispered memory in market shadows. These weren't copied by respectable scribes or debated in marble halls. They traveled in pockets, in tongues, and in the hush between two friends who knew when to close a door. These were the other Roman texts, the magical ones. Hand-copied spell lists, herb rolls, and charm books passed between midwives, herbalists, and women who were definitely not calling themselves witches, though plenty of neighbors did. Love was power, and power especially in a woman's hands made magistrates sweat. That's why love spells ranked among the most feared and the most popular pieces of forbidden knowledge. Roman charm books laid out how to win affection, spark obsession, or thaw a cold marriage. A strand of hair, a cup of wine, a murmured phrase by the new moon. Not theology, folk science. And it worked. Or at least, it felt like it did. One famous Campanian booklet promised fidelity if you stitched basil in your lover's tunic, whispered their name 3 times, and sprinkled rose water on the pillow. If they dreamed of you, the magic had taken. If not, there were stronger options. Aphrodisiacs filled these underground text recipes, blending old botany with bold imagination. Rocket and anise, ground oysters, satyrian and mandrake, sometimes effective, sometimes toxic. One cheerful apothecary recommended honey, wine, and powdered stag antler to awaken Venus's fire. He forgot to mention the nosebleeds. Men were curious, but women kept the keys, recipes, and rites, passing mother to daughter, especially where priests came rarely and midwives managed everything from birth to heartbreak. But owning such a role was a gamble. The moral police disliked women with too much knowledge, and a love spell could turn a healer into a heretic by sundown. So pages were hidden, burned, or disguised as herbals. You could be an herbalist on Tuesday and an omen of trouble by Thursday, depending on who looked and how. Copyists changed everything. Books stopped being aristocratic trophies and became commodities. And while pious collectors loved Stoics, the gray market discovered a better seller: desire. Rome became the hub of this quiet revolution: wealth, lenient shopkeepers, and a hearty appetite for vice. Behind moral essays and grammar, little private volumes appeared that weren't coy about their contents. They didn't pretend to be anatomy notes or devotional verse. They were explicit, illustrated, and ready to shock. Think of a notorious album of positions, a set of engraved bedroom scenes paired with wicked epigrams that made censors' wheeze plates seized. Copies burned, artist questioned, but the idea was out. You could use the scribe's pen for eros, and it wasn't going back in the amphora. Underground ateliers across the empire produced slim collections of love poetry, scandalous tales, and outright smut. Not mass-made expensive, bespoke, tailored to a patron's fantasies. Custom Romang fan fiction. Printers didn't exist yet, so trickery did. False title leaves, fake authors, innocent prefaces, and sober Latin wrappers that made filth look like philosophy. Inside, woodcuts and copperplates that made medical diagrams look bashful. For the right price, you got a book that thrilled, amused, or shocked without ever admitting you owned it. Noble houses kept them in keyed armaria, some bindings masked as lexicons or prayer books. Copyists didn't just democratize knowledge. They made lust portable. With every new title, readers crept closer to something revolutionary, pleasure without permission. By the end of the age, the line between education, entertainment, and seduction blurred into oblivion. What began as anatomical curiosity or moral instruction became a secret bookshelf of longing that crossed gender, class, and even piety. That's what made it dangerous. To the stern, these books stank of decay. To scholars, they were experiments. To actual readers' matrons, students, novices, merchants, they were something else entirely. Power. Not the courtroom kind, but the quieter, subversive kind that starts in margins. In a world that policed women's bodies, hushed their voices, and shamed their desires, these texts offered an alternate script where love wasn't always arranged. Pleasure could be named, and curiosity didn't need confessing in legal Latin. A love charm tucked in an herb roll, a censored couplet copied by hand, a banned poem read by lamplight, each a rebellion in disguise. And the men? For all the public brags and temple guilt, they bought them too. Philosophers who preached virtue by day, read scandal by night. A priest who thundered against lust might keep Ovid under his cassock. Humans compartmentalize. That's our superpower. The forbidden shelf wasn't a quirk. It was a mirror of a world in flux. Copyists had opened Pandora's box. Literacy spread. Ideas slipped chains. Once people learned a book could make them feel deeply, privately, sinfully, there was no going back. Most didn't survive intact, burned, hidden, mislabeled, but some did. They sit in vaults and rare rooms, foxed and fragile, still humming with whispered secrets. Because Rome wasn't only roads and rhetoric. It was a rebirth of desire. And between the edicts and the statues, the forbidden books tell us everything the marble couldn't.